In 1993, a woman named Lavina Fielding Anderson published an article in a journal called Dialogue. She had been a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints her entire life. She was a writer, an editor, and co-founder of an organization called the Mormon Alliance. The article documented what LDS Church was doing to members who asked the wrong questions. It named a committee. It named what the committee did. It named members who said they had been monitored by it.
She was excommunicated that same year. The church said the grounds were apostasy. For the next 30 years, Lavina Fielding Anderson attended her ward, same building, same congregation. She didn't leave the church, she kept attending. She didn't start a competing organization or renounce her membership. She showed up every week as a person the church has decided she was no longer a member of.
The committee she named has a scripture citation behind it, and the church's answer every time anyone has asked about it is that discipline belongs to local leaders. Nobody at the top judges. Nobody at the top penalizes. Hold on to Lavina's name. She comes back at the end, and she's how we find out whether that's true.
Hannah and Jess, we got away. Now we're unpacking what they won't say. Behind temple walls and cover-ups, we're pouring tea in your coffee cups. It's the post-Mormon post-mortem, digging up what they want forgotten. Trauma, truth, and crime, yeah, we're surviving. It's post-Mormon post-mortem.
Hello, Eternal Family. Welcome to Post-Mormon Postmortem, the podcast where we lovingly sift through the ashes of our former faith, one bizarre belief and repressed memory at a time.
We explore everything from the church's cultural weirdness and doctrinal whiplash to the deep wounds of religious trauma, Mormon crime, and the messy, glorious road to recovery.
Whether you're freshly out, years removed, or just ex-Mercurius, this really is the right place. We are here to hold space, spill tea, and call out the cultish stuff hiding in plain sight. I'm your host, Hannah.
And I'm Jess.
The Strengthening Church Members Committee, that's what it's called, the SCMC. It was established in 1985. And for the years that followed, when people asked the church about it, the church's position was that it didn't exist. That was the answer. There is no such committee. I know of none. Then, in 1992, the First Presidency issued a statement in the church news. And the statement confirmed the committee and described its function. The church's spokesperson at the time, Don Lefebvre, gave the operational description on the record. The committee, Lefebvre said, receives complaints, passes information to local leaders, and in his language, or the language of the First Presidency, quote, neither makes judgments nor imposes penalties, close quote.
So the First Presidency statement used language so close to Lefebvre's that you'd wonder which came first. The committee, the statement said, neither imposes nor directs church disciplinary action. One from the spokesman, one from the First Presidency. The committee receives, the committee passes. The committee neither judges nor penalizes. Whatever happens after the information leaves the committee's hands, whatever a stake president or bishop does with the name and a file, well, that belongs to local leaders.
As we've mentioned, the Strengthening Church Members Committee was born in the 1980s under Ezra Taft Benson's leadership. Church leaders created the SCMC to give local leaders information about members whose public criticism might hinder the church. The committee is supposed to be like a pass-through that receives complaints about members and assembles information on members and then sends that down to local leaders who then, according to the design and the purpose of the committee, have nothing further to do with it. They don't impose the judgments and the penalties. They're not accountable for what happens. It's the stake president in Bountiful who does something with the name that the committee sends him.
Right? So no judgment, no penalty, no fingerprints. Keep that design in mind. It comes back with an apostle on camera.
For our listeners who might not be in the exmo know, a stake president isn't like a regional manager in that he's not an employee of the institutional church. It's still a lay position, unpaid, appointed. It's a calling, a volunteer overseeing the local congregations. So the stake president is the one who convenes the membership council.
Have you ever been to a membership council? Did you ever, transgress that far that you got in trouble?
I was never called to a membership council because part of it is, to go through the process, you have to be repentant, right? So, to go through the process, to show up, right? Right. That's not to say I did anything and I wasn't repentant. I just didn't have that experience. But I will share that one of my sisters had to go through a disciplinary council, as it was called in those days. And she said it was designed to be maximally humiliating as possible.
Oh,
it
wow.
was by design. You were supposed to feel as inferior and small as you possibly can, like a small child scolded by 12 parents. How do you account for yourself? Give me all the details. And then what did you do? And then what did you do?
That's crazy. I'm not surprised.
Yeah, she said it was such an insight into, you give somebody a little bit of power who otherwise in their life would have zero authority to call you to account for your actions to them. It's really quite dangerous because the people who eagerly accept those callings shouldn't have them.
Right. The people who want the power are never the people who should wield it.
Exactly. It's the people who legitimately refuse, or the ones who are so reluctant and say yes because it's required of me, not because they want it.
Agree.
Like those are the people who need those positions.
Those are the ones you want.
Yeah.
Well, the First Presidency confirmed the committee, and they gave it a scriptural foundation. They cited Section 123 of the Doctrine and Covenants. So D&C 123 is a letter, but it's a letter that has become scripture. Joseph Smith wrote it from the Liberty Jail in 1839. He had been imprisoned for months, and the saints had been driven out of Missouri very violently by mobs with the backing of a governor's extermination order. He was writing to the membership from a jail cell during one of the worst stretches of the early church, one of the worst that they had experienced at that point. In the letter, Joseph gave them specific instructions. He told them to gather and document evidence, to build a written record of the injustices that had been committed against the saints. So the section heading in the canonized text names the subject, and I'm quoting here, duty of the saints in relation to their persecutors. Joseph named the perpetrators, the government, courts, officers, individuals who had mobbed and killed and expelled the saints. He was asking for a legal record of what outside enemies had done to the people of the church. Here's a direct quote. And again, we would suggest for your consideration the propriety of all the saints gathering up a knowledge of all the facts and sufferings and abuses put upon them by the people of this state. End quote.
The official explanation that evokes Doctrine and Covenants 123, where Joseph is instructing the saints to gather the information about the church's enemy, is an interesting context, right, to be quoting, because the scriptural justification being used is now being extended to members, right? It includes members, not persecutors. If your criticism becomes public, even if those members see themselves as completely faithful, its stated purpose and its actual role are quite different. Yeah, critics saw the Strengthening Church Members Committee with different colored glasses. F. Ross Peterson of Dialogue compared it to a paranoid political surveillance culture. Dean May argued that worthiness judgment properly belongs with bishops and stake presidents who know the members personally, and that files gathered from a distance could distort people's lives and intentions. I mean, imagine going and presenting at a conference, and that snapshot is what somebody determines your everything is, and then
Right. That
takes that back to church.
doesn't necessarily reflect your worldview.
Right, exactly. So basically, the existence of the committee exposed that the church had grown so large, because this is mid-80s, Ezra Taft Benson, right? Neoliberal economic policy is happening globally, and it's also like extending to this growth of the church. And so there's this distance between top leaders and local members. And then local leaders were not equipped to answer the questions that members were coming to them with. So it was supposed to be this two-way street. The Strengthening Church Members Committee was supposed to provide local leaders help with answering the questions that members had. And then it was like a surveillance system. And at the same time, the church absolutely distrusted scholars and intellectual thinkers. And as we know, it's not so much what you were saying, it's how you were saying it, because public speech was the problem. You know what wasn't allowed to be talked about? Women writing on theology, like Lavina Anderson talking about how women in the early church had performed priesthood rites.
Right.
LDS members who identified as LGBTQ, any serious academic who wanted to look at the church, seriously, people inside the church asking questions, the kind of people who were going to Sunstone and reading dialogue. These are all very inconvenient people for the church. So Joseph Smith wrote this letter from jail documenting what mobs had done to the saints. And now, as I said, the committee's pointing to that as authorization to document what saints are saying among themselves. It's highly problematic. I love D. Michael Quinn. I've said that 100 times. He wrote that the committee's operatives made tape recordings of members giving presentations at places like Sunstone and university classrooms, because of course a lot of these were BYU professors. One historian who isn't named by Quinn, he was just identified as a history professor at Utah State University. He was told during a meeting at church headquarters that his file went back to an anti-war statement he had made, Vietnam, I assume, as an undergrad decades earlier.
Oh, so creepy. So creepy.
It's like the McCarthy files, right?
It is.
Fully. It's like, but the church's own little CIA files. I mean, they were following the example, I'm sure, of the US government. The DNC, the scripture says, the people of this state, and as Jess noted, like that includes governments and courts and mobs of people and officers and what they did to the saints. And that's the document that the committee cites for what they're doing.
It's interesting. I was thinking about this, like what would be in my file if I was a current true believing member, and I am such a pinko commie liberal. Like I would have a file like this thick with things in there.
What about before you left the church? What would have been? I mean, you left so young.
Yeah, I think I left young enough that there really wouldn't have been all that much there. I mean, a few questions and snarky comments about whether listening to cocaine was really going to influence me to snort cocaine, or were some of these songs that were banned really devil worshiping, like, instruments, but nothing too severe.
Well, mine would start definitely, probably go back to primary, but in young women's, I was really bad. And it showed up like in sacrament meeting, my sister and I would do nothing but pass notes back and forth to each other. Right? And there was a member of the bishopric, shout out to Sam Samaru, who used to glare at us every week from the stand. Just glare at us, just fixate on us, just daggers. I know he must have been thinking, where are your parents? Why aren't your parents shutting this down? But we wouldn't be told. So we'd be writing, Brother Samaru staring at us again. Anyway, and then it would go into giving missionaries hand jobs, but we'll talk about that another day. That would be in my file.
We do need to get the down low on that one, Hannah.
And again, shout out Chad Miller, you know who you are.
When the church decides to take formal action against a member, up to and including removing them from membership, that happens at the local level. A stake president or bishop convenes what the church calls a membership council. The council deliberates, the council decides. Salt Lake doesn't run the proceeding there. Now, the name has changed twice. It started as a bishop's court, then it became a disciplinary council. Now it's a membership council.
Right. Because you don't want to call something discipline when you can call it loving and fellowshipping and belonging.
You can obscure what really happens by
No
changing
finger
the name.
wagging here. Right. Before September 1993 means anything, you need to know what existed to be taken apart. Dialogue, a journal of Mormon thought, put out its first issue in the spring of 1966, and it was started by young, idealistic Mormon intellectuals at Stanford, led by Eugene England and Wesley Johnson. And Sunstone, as a symposium and magazine, followed in 1974. It covered the same territory in the magazine, and it was published by its own nonprofit foundation. Its annual symposium was in Salt Lake City, and members presented papers on Mormon history and theology in hotel conference rooms. These were not ex-Mormon spaces. They weren't then, and they aren't now. The people writing and presenting were largely believing, practicing members. And when I say members, I mean Sunstone's current slogan is "There's many ways to Mormon." And the idea is that the mainstream church is just one avenue, right? They call themselves the Mormons, the official Mormons. They're the Brighamites. They followed Brigham Young, right? They held callings. They went to the temple. They were citing their sources, just like scholars do. They were using the named approved sources, looking in the footnotes of history and, making sure that everything aligned with their faith. They were faithful members. So for about 2 decades, there were rooms, there were spaces where you could be a faithful Latter-day Saint and ask hard questions out loud. And the people in those rooms, they worked together, they knew each other's names. And Lavina Anderson is interconnected there through Dialogue. She edited there. She was Dialogue's associate editor for 5 years. She had previously been at the Ensign. And D. Michael Quinn, a historian who would go on to write some of the most detailed institutional histories the church has never wanted to have written about it. He published there. Paul Toscano, the co-founder of Sunstone, lawyer and lay theologian, he presented there.
On August 23rd, 1991, the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 issued a joint statement 2 weeks after that year's Sunstone Symposium, expressing concern about symposia that, in their words, resulted in, quote, ridiculing sacred things or injuring the church, detracting from its mission, or jeopardizing the well-being of its members, end quote. The statement didn't name names. People watching closely at the time pointed straight at sessions like Colleen McDaniel's.
Absolutely. So that is a session that would have raised some eyebrows. Colleen McDaniel wasn't even a Mormon. She was a University of Utah professor who had presented at Sunstone that year on temple garments using the eye of a scholar, a historian, an outsider who'd never been part of the system herself. She wasn't trying to provoke anyone. She's a serious academic. She said later she was surprised to learn her paper was one of the ones that had reportedly landed badly with church leadership. So the church's statement, it couldn't shut Sunstone down. The church didn't control it then and it doesn't control it now. It's an independent organization. But what the church can and did control was BYU. In the years after, BYU faculty participation in Sunstone dropped off noticeably, even as the overall participation rose. Church leaders couldn't touch the space, but they could touch who from their own university was allowed to be caught standing in it. On May 18th, 1993, Boyd K. Packer gave an address to the All-Church Coordinating Council. The All-Church Coordinating Council is a body of senior church leadership. I bet it's very white in that room. Packer was then a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. That's the second highest governing body of the church. In that address, Packer named his 3 arch nemesis, his biggest threats to the church. They are gays and lesbians, the whole movement, feminists, the whole lot of them, and then in his phrase, the so-called scholars and intellectuals. He is big mad about them all.
Very big madly. In September 93, 4 months after that address, 6 members of the LDS Church were called before disciplinary councils. So there were 6 councils, 6 different wards, but 5 different stakes because 2 of them shared the same stake. But this all happened in the same month. The 6 who were called before the councils were Lavina Fielding Anderson, Paul Toscano, Maxine Hanks, Lynn Canaveral Whitesides, Avram Giladi, and D. Michael Quinn. They became known as the September Six.
Okay, so Lavina Anderson and Paul Toscano fit in the scholars and intellectuals camp, so-called. Don't forget the so-called part, just to be disparaging in Packer's framing. Maxine Hanks and Lynn Whitesides were both feminists. Avram Gileadi, he was a scriptural scholar and a BYU professor. He rejects his membership as part of the September 6 and really sycophantically wanted his way back into the church. And so I say, if you don't want to be aligned with the September 6, they don't want you either.
We'll
do a whole episode on that. Yeah. We'll do a whole episode on that. D. Michael Quinn was a historian who, as I said, he just did the most thorough institutional history of the church. So the church's position was obviously based on their framing of the Strengthening Church Members Committee. And if that isn't like some high dystopian speak, I don't know what is, right? Saying the opposite. Stake presidents and bishops, they're using their judgment, and there's no coordination with Salt Lake. This isn't a higher up thing to come after so-called scholars and intellectuals, is what the church said. But we know that the information flows downwards. But the committee, no, they said they don't judge or penalize. So that's right. It must just be that whatever the local leaders are doing is their own determination, even though it was 6 councils in 1 month. And Boyd K. Packer's 3 categories of enemies.
Yeah. So Joanna Brooks was a student at BYU that year. And she's since become a scholar of American religion. She's got a PhD from UCLA. She's the author of several books on Mormonism. She's a board member at Dialogue, that same journal that published Anderson's chronology. But in 1993, she was an undergraduate, and several of her own professors were among the people the church pushed out that year for their scholarship. So she's written that Packer's address, that same one naming scholars, feminists, and gay and lesbian members as threats, like inherent threats to the church, she said that that was the moment she understood that the church saw someone like her as a danger to it before she had done anything herself. But quick pause here. If you're new to our podcast, we're Post-Mormon Postmortem, and hitting follow means you don't miss the next scintillating episode.
The September 6 were prominent enough that the church's independent local decision story got national coverage. Most of the committee's work was never that visible. What had happened, I just learned this, that what happened at Sunstone was, so Lavina Anderson presents her paper, Eugene England stands up and says, the biggest threat to the church is that we've got these note takers amongst us, basically, these file keepers, this committee. So that gets written up in the New York Times because they were covering it. And it was for that reason that the church had to respond a couple of days later to the existence of the committee. And then, of course, a full year later comes these excommunications or, disfellowships. So this is prominent enough that the nation is paying attention.
Right.
Now, after being quiet and invisible for decades, like, people are aware of the existence of this committee. And so jump to the 2000s and beyond with the internet, and the names of the people who are calling out this committee stop being the editors of Dialogue Journal and start being, YouTubers and podcasters and people who can talk about it in other public spaces.
Yeah, Grant Palmer was one of those folks. He was a longtime instructor at the church's own education system. He spent 34 years teaching seminary and institute classes, and then he published a book in 2002, An Insider's View of Mormon Origins, which examines the historical origins of the Book of Mormon. And I gotta say, I hope that he tread very carefully there. The committee reportedly sent a dossier on him to his stake president. And in December 2004, he was disfellowshipped. He was still a member, but barred from the temple, from callings, and from the sacrament. John Dehlin, whose name may be familiar to a lot of folks, he faced discipline in 2015. John Dehlin founded Mormon Stories. It's a podcast for Latter-day Saints working through doubt a whole decade before 2015. His stake president had news clippings and a lengthy transcription of one of Dehlin's podcast episodes when he was excommunicated for apostasy. Whether the committee provided those materials has not been confirmed. A Salt Lake news station investigated, and the church, of course, declined to comment. But so the September 6th were the highest profile cases, but they weren't the last, right? There were more names, more files, more local leaders, and they're all supposedly acting on their own pastoral judgment. So everything so far we're seeing has come from statements, from memos, and from press reports. And people are trying to piece this together. So in 2012, a reporter put the question to an apostle directly on March 27th on BBC Two. So they ran a documentary called This World, the Mormon Candidate, and it was produced during Mitt Romney's presidential campaign when the British press was doing its accounting of the LDS Church. The reporter was John Sweeney. He sat down with Jeffrey R. Holland, a sitting apostle, at LDS Church headquarters in Salt Lake City.
Before Sweeney got anywhere near an apostle, he had to go through the church's press office. That's Michael Purdy's job, Director of Media Relations, LDS Church Public Affairs. John Sweeney asked him directly, what is the Strengthening Church Members Committee? Does it still exist? And let's see what Purdy has to say about that.
To find out more about the mysterious Strengthening Church Members Committee. Off to the church to meet its chief spokesman and the mastermind behind the I Am a Mormon campaign, Michael Purdy. What's the Strengthening Church Members Committee, and does it still exist?
I don't know, and I'm not, I guess that's a question not for me. I couldn't tell you that, I don't know.
You're the head of media relations for the church.
Right.
And I've spoken to people, ex-members of the church, who say the Strengthening Church Members Committee does exist. Does it still exist?
I've heard that, yeah, there is a Strengthening Church Members Committee, but I couldn't tell you the details of how that works, but we'd be happy to provide someone that can.
Sorry for my confusion. When I originally asked you, you weren't sure. Now you do know that it exists, and you will give me somebody who knows something about it.
Absolutely.
So on the Strengthening Church Members Committee, the spokesman for the Mormon Church couldn't give me a satisfactory answer. Maybe
So the church's own spokesman couldn't say whether it existed initially. So Sweeney went to someone who'd actually have to know. Jeffrey R. Holland confirmed the committee exists. He said its primary purpose is to guard against polygamists.
answer. Maybe the apostle could. What is the Strengthening Church Members Committee?
The Strengthening the Church Members Committee was born some years ago to protect predatory practices of polygamists.
I asked what is it?
Oh, that's what it is. It is to protect...
So it does still exist?
It does still exist. It does still exist.
And it looks at... it's there to defend the church against polygamists?
Principally. That is still the principal task.
And what is its subsidiary task?
I suppose just to be protective generally, just to watch and care for any insidious influence. But for all intents and purposes, all that I know about it is primarily to guard against polygamy. That would be the substantial, essential part of their work. I'm not on that committee, so I can't speak.
This is a committee the church confirmed in a First Presidency statement in 1992. So why all the secrecy, right?
Why can't he speak to it? Just because he's
No
not on it?
kidding. And in 1993, the same year as the September 6th, then Apostle Dehlin A. Jokes had characterized the committee on record as a clipping service that monitored speeches, writings, and activities of those suspected of apostasy and passed material to church officials.
Yeah, just like the CIA was a
Just
clipping
like-
service.
Yeah. So interesting. So after the documentary aired, a PR firm representing the church hand-delivered a letter to BBC offices in London, and it formally accused the BBC of bad faith journalism, arguing that the interview's parameters were supposed to be about, quote, the Mormon moment, also known as Mitt Romney's campaign, the church's growth, and its integration into mainstream culture, rather than a deep dive into historical temple penalties or internal surveillance committees.
They thought it was going to be a puff piece.
Yeah, exactly. You're sitting down with a journalist who is going to ask whatever he
A
wants.
BBC journalist at that,
Yes.
right? Like, come on.
Mhm. The letter claimed that the documentary's framing relied too heavily on a biased selection of ex-members to paint a deliberately sensationalized negative portrait of the faith, thereby violating the BBC's statutory duty for fair and balanced reporting. So
Yes,
Sweeney,
when the BBC reports on World War II and they don't give the Nazis equal airtime and as valid and air their theology, that too violates the BBC's duty for fair and balanced
And
reporting. Don't you know that you're not allowed to tell history accurately? It
You
might
have
not be
to-
fair and balanced to my point of view, to the way I want the world to be.
exactly.
Good God, it doesn't work. It doesn't work.
Doesn't work. And Sweeney defended his reporting by stating that Holland was fully briefed on who he was and what they would be discussing. So let's look at this. An apostle who wouldn't speak to it unless really pressed. We have a spokesman who claimed not to know it existed, but then claimed it did, but he didn't know what it did. So
I mean,
then
God, just deny till you die. You've said no, so you've got to stick
Right.
to that now, right? Like, now you got to stick to it.
Right. But then we shove in this letter to the BBC that's not about what was said, but how the question was asked. Everybody's so upset. And by the way, you can find us on Instagram and TikTok at Postmormon Postmortem and online at postmormonpostmortem.com, where we will surely be continuing this conversation.
For sure.
Every name in the September 6th belonged to someone who tangled with the committee and lived to talk about it afterward on a podcast, in an interview, in a stake president's office. But only one of the names we've said today belongs to the person who first put the committee's own operations on paper. Here's what happened to her.
Lavina Fielding Anderson's September 1993 excommunication had roots more than a decade old. On June 25, 1981, after 8 years at the Ensign, Anderson was fired for trying to share the original version of Hartman Rector's General Conference talk with Sunstone. So after the firing, Anderson built an independent professional life. She created Editing Inc., edited the Journal of Mormon History, and worked on microhistories. Anderson had already spent years helping Mormon women's history reach print. In 1987, she co-edited Sisters in Spirit, Mormon Women in Historical and Cultural Perspective with Maureen Ursenbach Beecher. And then she published the article that Jess referred to, the big dialogue article, The LDS Intellectual Community and Church Leadership and Contemporary Chronology. And that was 93. That's posted on Patreon. That article, along with her Mormon Alliance work, became the material that led to her being excommunicated. Anderson saw herself as a witness. She knew church leaders might tell the same stories differently, but she believed the record still had to be made. And thank you, sister. For more than 50 pages, she listed incidents involving censorship, blacklisting, job loss, institutional pressure, threats to temple access, discipline, and excommunication. She named leaders and named victims. She believed the pattern would become visible if the evidence was placed together. And that is a scholar after my own heart. Anderson didn't attend her own disciplinary council. She said that she stayed home and ate popcorn with her friends and watched movies and had a great night while they convened without her. But the next morning, it just hit her hard, right? She was prepared herself, but she wasn't prepared for the weight of being cut off from membership and ritual life and community. So the excommunication letter that she was given gave no reason and no steps for returning. And when she asked, then she was told that she had been excommunicated for apostasy because she was thinking outside of gospel principles and leading others with her.
But she kept attending church for 30 years to the same ward, and she sang the hymns. She could not take the sacrament. She couldn't hold a calling or enter the temple, but she kept showing up anyway. So hold that image. She was there 30 years in the pews as a non-member. Because here's the design promise again of the committee. Word for word. The committee neither imposes nor directs church disciplinary action. That was from the First Presidency in 1992. Discipline belongs to local leaders. Local leaders judge. Local leaders decide. But in 2019, Lavina Fielding Anderson's bishop and her stake president recommended that her membership be restored. Both of them did. They're local leaders, and they said yes. The First Presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints reviewed that recommendation and blocked it.
Jess, you just said local leaders decide.
I did. Wow.
I'm so confused. Which direction does this work? How does this work?
How does it work?
God damn.
In October 2023, Lavina Fielding Anderson died. After her death, the church readmitted her posthumously. Thanks for spending your time with us today. If this one landed differently than most, or if it didn't, tell us about it in the comments.
A really super easy way to show your support is to give us 5 stars wherever you're listening. And another way is to head over to Patreon or buy me a coffee and join our growing community of subscribers. We are so grateful for you.
We sure are. And as I mentioned earlier, you can find us on Instagram and TikTok at Postmormon Postmortem, or online at postmormonpostmortem.com. And of course, wherever you listen to your podcasts.
We will be back tomorrow with an episode of Mormon Mondays, where we take a quick look at something in the recent world of Mormondom. And of course, we'll be back next Sunday with a full episode just in time for Sacrament Meeting. Until then, Jess, I'm sorry for what I said when I was Mormon.
And I'm sorry for what I said when I was Mormon too, specifically for telling my friend Lisa, who thought she was being watched, that she was being paranoid.